Welcome and welcome back. Last episode, we took some time to look back at the history of graphic novels and comics, providing some important background context for the changes we've begun to see in both the industry and the medium. But before we attempt to grapple with these shifting trends, let's take some time to discuss how we've learned to read these images. In this episode, we'll be focusing on the concept of visual literacy, what it means, how we learn that visual language, and of course, how we read comics. Visual literacy is something we practice every day, typically with little conscious thought. When we see a yellow triangle sign, we know to yield. When we see brand logos, we know it represents a company or product. When we look at maps, we understand a visual concept of scale, of boundaries, of paths to follow. Recent research has found that the most basic of image processing takes as little as 13 milliseconds. Just 13 milliseconds for your brain to see an image and begin to categorize and interpret it. But as natural as this process is, the ability to comprehend the meaning and significance of what we see is to some degree learned. We process visual information in terms of our environmental context, our other senses, and especially our previous knowledge, and that's visual literacy. Merriam-Webster defines visual literacy as the ability to recognize and understand ideas conveyed through visible actions or images. Essentially, it's the skill that allows us to read, interpret, and write images. Any image, any icon, any color we see are all processed in terms of deriving meaning, interpreting the visual details to determine significance. The term visual literacy, though, goes beyond the simple concept of image perception and interpretation. The word literacy introduces the idea that images are a language, something that we can learn to read and by proxy write in order to communicate complex thoughts and narratives. And while it may seem contradictory to think that we can write an image, writing here reminds us that images are deliberately created in order to inspire feelings, provoke thought, and communicate ideas. They're encoded with details for viewers to read, similar to how we learn letters, which are then structured into words and then into complex sentences. Visual literacy proposes that the shapes, colors, and various iconography of images are building blocks, tools that can then be structured and restructured to tell the stories we want to tell. It may seem strange to take a whole episode to review the idea of visual literacy when it's such a casually accepted part of our daily lives. However, we tend to take for granted this process of understanding. Visual literacy is a term that's only been coined and recognized fairly recently. It's credited to John Debes, who first used the term in 1969 and went on to co-found the International Visual Literacy Association, or the IVLA. The IVLA is a scholarly organization of professionals across disciplines, creating a forum to better understand how we learn and communicate through visuals. They also publish the twice-annual Journal of Visual Literacy, which I highly recommend checking out if you're interested. But the point is, while it's hardly a shock to the art community that images have meaning that audiences can interpret as they will, modern scholars are now more widely recognizing the significance of visual literacy, particularly as a form of communication. In fact, the American Association of College and Research Libraries only implemented visual literacy competency standards for higher education in 2011, recognizing the need to produce visually literate individuals who are both critical consumers of visual media and competent contributors to a body of shared knowledge and culture. And I don't think that's coincidental. Within this past century, and particularly within the past 2-3 decades, we've seen a widespread proliferation of intentional, constructed images with the design of encoding meaning. From movies to television to commercials to magazines to brand packaging to comics, we are constantly inundated with images that carry meaning for us to parse out. This is especially true and relevant in our current age of internet entertainment and content consumption. According to Mary Meeker's 2015 Internet Trends Report, people uploaded an average of 1.8 billion digital images every day. And while we won't see all 1.8 billion of those daily images, according to Nielsen, American adults are estimated to spend more than 11 hours per day watching, reading, listening, and interacting with media. That's the majority of our waking hours spent consuming, processing, and interpreting images. And visual literacy reminds us that the process is a skill, something we learn to do, and do pretty well. Just look at memes. About every new week comes with a new meme, a new image format, which we learn to read and understand, and then adapt again and again and again. until it becomes entirely unintelligible to anyone without the context and literacy necessary to read it. But even more than that, it's not just that we're consuming more images, we're also consuming them more critically. Part of this shift towards teaching visual literacy is part of a growing awareness that visual narratives are worth studying. In the US, film was only first recognized as an artistic medium protected under the First Amendment's freedom of speech in 1952, previously suggesting that film was just for business, not to actually express our freedom and to express our ideas. And as we discussed last episode, it's taken even longer to recognize the narrative value of comic books. It's taken critical literature, like Jules Feiffer's The Great Comic Book Heroes, to assess the appeal of comic books as a medium. And then books like Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics and Will Eisner's Comics and Sequential Art to discuss the techniques and skills that are necessary to creating good comics. By bringing in a critical perspective, the books emphasize the artistry behind the product and our growing need to understand and fluently read this visual language. Looking specifically at comics, there's certainly a standard visual language used to understand and then perceive the narrative told in them. At its most straightforward, comics rely upon the sequential ordering of images, often with some aspect of written language to accompany the visual. These images are rarely pulled from reality and are instead drawn representations, icons that we know represent far more. This includes everything from stink lines to suggest smell, to onomatopoeia text to mimic sound, to stylized human figures, providing an iconographic reality that is both deliberately designed and universally relatable. As for structure, each segment of a comic, each static image, often contained within some sort of box, is a frame. Those frames can be practically any size or shape, arranged on the page for audiences to read sequentially. The movement between the static images is done in the negative spaces, the gutters between each frame, where we interpret the connection and progression between each image. Seem familiar? Even if you aren't an avid comic reader, this structure shouldn't be too difficult to follow. Colors and iconography appeal to societal connotations, such as knowing that red usually indicates anger, passion, or love, or knowing that a heart shape represents love, despite not actually being heart-shaped or having anything to do with romance. Same as books, comics read in the same pattern as their original language. So for English and related languages, comics read from top down, left to right. More than that though, the frame-by-frame structure of sequential comic art directly correlates to film. In a literal sense, film itself is simply a series of static images, frames, played so quickly that the human eye creates the illusion of continuity and movement. If you placed each frame beside each other, or just looked at film strips, the movies would look more like really slow comics. But the similarities in visual structure between comics and film is far more obvious and intuitive than that. Films typically begin with storyboards, which allow the creators to plan shot by shot what the audience will see, and are essentially just like frames in a comic. Each shot is reasonably comparable to a frame, with the same consideration in designing it. The creators need to determine what angle to look from, how close the subject will be, how will the shadows and color impact the mood, what to put in the mise-en-scène, the arrangement of the background and the props in it, and the cut between shots is not unlike the gutter between frames of a comic, separating two images and indicating that the audience is meant to juxtapose the two, to understand them in relation to each other. Granted, films and comics obviously can't entirely replicate one another. Film is constrained to the same space, with each image replacing the other, and is reliant on the actual passage of time to tell the story. Meanwhile, in the words of Scott McCloud, space does for comics what time does for film. In other words, the sequential order of images, the way different frames can be resized or organized on the page, allow for the comic creator to manipulate the reader's experience of time. Even though all the frames of a comic technically exist all at once, we're able to read them in chronological order, stopping longer on larger frames, or reading faster if the frame is angular. In a similar vein, comics cannot include sound or music, but are still able to include onomatopoeia and of course dialogue, so that readers can perceive the sound anyway. But despite, and perhaps because of these differences, it's important to remember that film or comic, we read the images in a similar way, understanding the order and sequence of the images like the syntax of a sentence. Images alone always carry meaning, but once someone puts them in a sequence, we have narrative. And it's in large part thanks to our learned visual literacy that we understand what they're trying to say. All of these techniques and symbols and iconography inform our visual literacy, providing the building blocks of a visual language. And with all language, it's important because it provides the framework for communication. As Debes described in his first definition of visual literacy, through the creative use of these visual competencies, he is able to communicate with others. Through the appreciative use of these competencies, he is able to comprehend and enjoy the masterworks of visual communication. Gender assumption aside, Debes acknowledges here that visual literacy is about being able to effectively convey ideas. Having a common visual language means that authors and artists can encode messages into their work and know that their audience will understand, deriving the intended meaning from their creation. In later episodes, we'll see the relevance of this visual literacy in standard comic language as we move into adaptations and the burgeoning multimedia webcomic industry. More and more, thanks to the widespread technological access and the internet as a distribution platform, webcomics are innovating not just the industry but the medium itself. They still utilize the same hallmarks of traditional comic design, using the same characteristics of visual language and similar syntactical structure. But that established visual language simply serves as the building blocks for comic creation, a foundation that can then be built upon, reduced down, or even broken as the medium evolves. There are webcomics out right now that blur the lines of what can even be defined as a comic, and they're able to adapt and innovate because of the foundational visual literacy, providing context to help facilitate readers' understanding, even if they've never seen anything quite like it before. But that's for another time. Next episode, we'll be looking at the state of the comic industry, picking up our discussion on comics and graphic novel history, and turning towards the business side of things. We'll be focusing specifically on how the industry is currently structured, how recent technological and cultural developments have forced the industry to evolve, and, naturally, whether or not the comic industry is dying. Thank you all for joining me.